An Apache girl was sold like an animal. Lonely rancher bought and treated her like a queen. The vast and silent ranch house exuded a hollow loneliness thick with regret and the unspoken tension of the land itself. Ethan worked the needle through worn leather, mending a saddle that had no rider. Each stitch was a practiced motion, a futile attempt to repair a life that had fractured years ago. His quiet diligence was a mask for the gaping sorrow within. His gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the small carved bird Alara had made a fragile thing in a world of grit. He had failed to protect her from the town's venom, a truth that gnawed at his soul. Tomorrow's ride for supplies was a necessary evil, a distraction, but he didn't know he was riding towards a different kind of reckoning. He sought escape from one ghost only to find himself at a dusty auction pen where a living soul was shackled on the block, and the bidding was about to begin. The silence of the ranch house was a living thing. It was a vast and hollow vessel exuding a loneliness so profound it felt like a fine layer of dust coating every surface. It clung to the faded calico curtains Alara had sewn and settled in the cold ashes of the hearth, a constant physical presence. From his workbench, Ethan Finch felt it press in on him, the quiet ghost of a life that was no longer his. He worked the awl through a strip of worn leather, his hands moving with a slow, practiced rhythm that belied the chaos in his soul. He was mending a saddle a fool's errand. The saddle belonged to a rider who would never return. He had failed her. The thought was a stone in his gut. A cold, heavy stone. His gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, to the small, impossibly delicate bird she had carved from a piece of sun-bleached cottonwood. It was a fragile thing in a world of grit, a testament to a softness he had failed to shield. The town of Redemption had not been kind to outsiders, and Alara, with her strange accent and gentle ways, had been the ultimate outsider. He hadn't fought hard enough, hadn't stood tall enough. Now all that was left was the silence and the bird and the mending of things that could never truly be fixed. The ride into town was a necessary evil, a jarring break from his self-imposed exile. Redemption tasted of rust, sweat, and the simmering contempt of small men. As he tied his horse outside the mercantile, he could feel their eyes on him. The widower. The man who couldn't keep his own wife safe. Just the salt and flour. Henderson. Ethan set his voice a low rasp from disuse. The proprietor barely looked up. "That'll be all for you, Finch." The use of his last name was a deliberate, cold jab. In this town he was no longer a neighbor. He was just Finch. As he was leaving, a commotion from the far end of the street drew his unwilling attention. A crowd had gathered near the livestock pens, their voices a low, ugly hum of excitement. It was auction day. He saw Silas Kane, his rival rancher, standing near the front, a cruel proprietary sneer on his face. Ethan turned to go, wanting no part of it. But the auctioneer's voice boomed sharp and vile. "All right, folks, we've sold the beasts now for something a little more exotic." A murmur of sick anticipation rippled through the crowd. They weren't done. Ethan froze, a cold dread washing over him. Two brutish men dragged something no someone onto the crude wooden platform. It was a girl, an Apache girl, barely a woman. She was bound in iron cuffs, her buckskin dress torn, a fresh bruise purpling her high cheekbone. But it was her eyes that seized him, that stopped the very breath in his lungs. They were not broken. They held no fear. They held the vast, unforgiving stillness of the mesas at dusk. In them, he saw the echo of Alara's quiet defiance, the same unbroken spirit staring down a world that wished to crush it. "Torn straight from the wild," the auctioneer bellowed. "Hardly been broke. Look at the spirit in that one who'll start the bidding for this prime piece of property." Silas Kane laughed, raising a hand. $20. Another man shouted, "25." Ethan felt the blood roaring in his ears. He saw Silas's hungry eyes on the girl, and he knew what kind of life awaited her. He saw the faces in the crowd twisted with hatred and lust. He saw Ilara's ghost whispering a silent, desperate plea in the wind. This time, the voice in his soul screamed, "Do not fail." 50. Ethan heard himself say the word ripping from his throat. The crowd turned, stunned. Silas's face darkened with rage. 60. 100. Ethan countered, his voice ringing with a cold, clear finality he didn't know he possessed. A shocked silence fell over the pen. It was a fortune, an insane amount. Silas stared, his jaw working, but he said nothing. "Sold," the auctioneer cried, slamming his gavel. "To the grieving hermit, Ethan Finch." The ride back was a journey through a canyon of silence. She sat on the pack horse. He led her back, ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She had not spoken a word. She had not looked at him once. He had freed her from the auction block only to lead her on a new chain. At the ranch, he cut the ropes from her wrists with his own knife. "You're safe here," he said, the words feeling hollow and false even to him. He showed her to a small, clean room at the back of the house. He left a basin of fresh water, a bar of soap, and one of Ilara's old simple dresses folded neatly on the cot. He closed the door, leaving her in the quiet. He had done a good thing. He had done a monstrous thing. He didn't know which. Later that night, he cooked a stew, the first real meal he'd made in months. He filled a plate and a cup of fresh well water, placing the tray on a small stool outside her closed door. He knocked softly. "Food," was all he said, before retreating to the shadows of his own living space, the silence of the house now heavier than ever before. Hours passed. The fire died to embers. Finally, he walked back down the hallway. The tray was still there, untouched, the cup full, the stew cold. The closed door was an indictment. The silence was her answer. He had purchased her body, but her soul remained a fortress, and he was the enemy at the gate. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, etched in silence and dust. A week passed, then two. Ethan's life fell into a tense, fragile rhythm. He would rise before the sun, work the ranch until his muscles screamed, and leave a plate of food on the stool outside her door. Sometimes when he returned, a piece of bread would be gone. Once the entire plate was empty. He took these small offerings not as a sign of trust, but as a simple acknowledgement of survival. She was a ghost in his house, a silent, watchful presence whose footsteps he rarely heard, but whose gaze he felt constantly a weight on the back of his neck. She was a question he had no way of asking, and she was a silence that gave no answers. He tried to speak to her once, his voice a clumsy, rough thing in the quiet kitchen. "The dress, it was my wife's. I thought—" He trailed off. She had simply looked at him, her dark eyes holding a universe of things he could not read, and then turned and walked away. She never wore the dress. She continued to wear her own torn buckskin, which she had mended with a skill that shamed his own rough saddle stitching. Then the sickness came. It began with a single cough, a low, rattling cough that echoed unnaturally in the morning chill. Ethan dismissed it. A weakling, that's all. But the next day, two more were coughing, their heads low, their eyes clouded with a milky film. By the end of the week, it had spread through his small herd like a prairie fire, a lung fever that left the animals gasping their breath, coming in shallow, wheezing pulls. He fought it with everything he had. He rode the long day's journey to redemption and spent a month's worth of credit on expensive powders and tonics from Henderson's Mercantile. The remedies smelling of sulfur and false hope did nothing. The sickly sweet scent of death began to cling to the barn, a smell he knew too well. He was losing them. He was losing the last thing he had in the world. The ranch was not just land and cattle. It was his penance, his last stand against the encroaching wilderness of his grief. And he was failing. Through it all, she watched. From the porch steps, her hands busy weaving a small basket from brittle prairie grass. From the shadows of the barn door, a silent silhouette against the dying light. He felt a hot, unreasonable anger rise in him. Did she find this amusing? This slow, agonizing failure of the man who owned her? He saw contempt in her stillness, a curse in her silence. One morning, after a long night of watching a young heifer die, he stumbled out of the barn defeated. And he saw that she was gone. Her room was empty. The small basket she was weaving lay unfinished on the porch. A wild, panicked thought seized him. She had run, fled into the wilderness to die rather than stay with him. He felt a surprising, shameful pang of loss, immediately followed by the bitter certainty that he deserved it. He worked through the day in a fog of despair, the silence of the ranch now absolute, a tomb. But as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple, he saw a figure walking toward the house from the distant brooding hills. It was her. She was not running. She was walking with a calm, steady purpose. Her arms were laden with a collection of gnarled, dark roots, pale, bell-shaped flowers he'd never seen before, and the broad, waxy leaves of some unknown plant. She walked past him without a word, her face set with a grim determination, and went straight to the outdoor cook fire. He watched, mesmerized, as she crushed the roots with a heavy stone, her movements fluid and sure. She steeped the leaves and flowers in a bucket of boiling water, and a strange, earthy, and deeply medicinal scent filled the air, cutting through the stench of sickness. It was the scent of the earth's secrets. She took the dark, potent-smelling brew and walked into the barn. She went to the first sick calf, the one whose rattling breaths were the shallowest, and knelt beside it. Ethan followed, his heart hammering in his chest. This was madness. She would poison them. But then he looked at the animal, its life already slipping away, and he looked at the empty tonic bottles littering the ground. His way had failed. He had one choice left: surrender. He stepped forward, not to stop her, but to help. He knelt on the other side of the calf and held its head steady as she gently coaxed the strange dark liquid into its mouth. She worked through the night, moving from one sick animal to the next, a priestess performing a sacred ancient rite, and he was her silent, humbled acolyte. The next morning, Ethan woke in the hayloft, his body aching. He woke to a different kind of quiet, not the rattling silence of death, but the deep, peaceful silence of rest. He scrambled down the ladder. The calf that had been closest to death was now standing shaky but alive, its breathing slow and even. The fever in its eyes was gone. He searched for her, his heart a wild drum against his ribs. He found her by the small creek that bordered his land, washing the dirt and grime from her hands. The rising sun caught in her dark hair, framing her in a halo of impossible light. He stood a few feet away, the gulf between their worlds as wide as the prairie itself. The words "thank you" felt clumsy and inadequate. They were the words of a master to a servant. He had to find new words. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. Those roots. He began the question, a raw, desperate plea for understanding. The ones you used, where did you find them? She stopped washing her hands. For the first time she turned and looked at him, truly looked at him. And in the vast, still quiet of the morning she gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. The lesson was about to begin. A new language took root in the silence of the ranch. It was a vocabulary of gesture, of shared sky, of the spaces between breaths. Ethan became Nayland's shadow, following her into the low, rolling hills where the sun baked the scent of sage from the dry earth. He, who had thought he knew this land, learned he had been blind. He had seen only rock and dirt and distances to be crossed. She taught him to see a world teeming with life, with purpose. This leaf, she would show him by crushing it, was for fever. This gnarled root, by pointing to a wound on her own arm, was for closing cuts. This pale flower held to her temple was for easing pain. He learned not with words, but with an attention so focused It felt like a form of prayer. In return, he left a sharpened knife by her door. He repaired the worn sole of her moccasin. Small, silent offerings. A truce blooming in the wasteland of their shared isolation. The fear in her eyes had been replaced by something else. A watchful curiosity. She was no longer his prisoner, and he strangely no longer felt like a ghost in his own home. One evening, the air cool and smelling of distant rain, they sat in the main room, cleaning and sorting the day's harvest of herbs. A fragile peace had settled between them, the quiet no longer a weapon, but a comfort. Her gaze drifted from her work to the mantelpiece, to the small carved bird that had haunted Ethan's every waking moment. She looked at it for a long time, her head tilted. Then she looked at him and spoke her first question. Her voice, unused for so long, was a soft, husky whisper. Who was the bird's song? For the question, so simple, so poetic, undid him. It wasn't who made this, but a question that saw straight into the heart of the object, into the soul of the one it was made for. He felt the stone in his gut shift, the grief he had held clenched in his fists for years beginning to loosen its grip. He swallowed his throat dry. Her name was Alara. He told the story. The words came out haltingly at first, then like a river breaking a dam, a torrent of guilt and sorrow that filled the quiet room. He spoke of Ireland, of a famine that had sent her across an ocean. He spoke of her arrival in Redemption, a town that prided itself on its piety but showed no mercy. They called her a papist, a savage of a different color. They shunned her in the street, their whispers a slow, insidious poison. She had a spirit like yours. Ethan rasped, his eyes fixed on the flickering lamplight, unable to meet her gaze. Quiet, but unbreakable. I thought my love would be a shield. I thought this ranch would be a fortress. He let out a harsh, broken laugh. But I was a coward. I didn't fight their hatred. I just endured it, and I let her endure it. He told her of the long winter of the sickness that took hold of her, and of the town doctor who had made excuses, who had barely touched her. It wasn't just the fever that killed her, he whispered, the admission, a fresh wound. It was the cold, the loneliness. I let their world freeze her heart. Finally, he looked at her, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. When I saw you on that platform, I saw them doing it all over again, selling a human soul because they deemed it less than their own. And a voice in me, a voice I thought was long dead, screamed, "Not again!" I didn't buy you to be my slave, Nalin. I bought you to try and earn a forgiveness Alara can no longer give me. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and absolute. He felt bare, exposed, expecting her to recoil from the ugliness of his truth. She did not move. She simply watched him, her face unreadable in the dim light. Then slowly, she reached across the table. Her fingers did not touch his hand. Instead, they gently traced the old, jagged scar on his forearm, a mark left by a barbed wire fence years ago, a scar he had long since forgotten. Her touch was not one of pity. It was one of recognition. I see your wounds, too. The unspoken message was as clear as a spoken word. In that single feather-light touch, a bond was forged, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their disparate griefs. The silence that returned was not empty. It was full. The moment was shattered by the sudden aggressive sound of an approaching horse. It stopped outside the creak of saddle leather, a sharp, menacing sound in the night. Ethan was on his feet in an instant, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt. The peace was gone. The world had returned. The heavy footsteps on the porch were unmistakable. A dark shape filled the doorway before a heavy fist hammered on the wood. It was Silas Kane. Finch, his voice boomed thick with whiskey and malice. I know you're in there. I've come to see about the property you stole from me. A man ought to take proper care of his investments. Things have a way of getting damaged out here in the wild. Silas Kane's threat was not a boast. It was a promise. The world began to shrink the very next day. When Ethan rode into redemption, the town's simmering contempt had boiled over into open hostility. At the mercantile, Henderson refused to look him in the eye, his hands trembling slightly as he polished an already clean counter. "I can't sell to you, Finch." Ethan's hands tightened on the worn canvas of his supply sack. "Since when does Silas Kane run your store, Henderson?" "He runs this town." The man muttered, his gaze still fixed on the wood grain. "And we don't cater to your kind of charity. Now get out, before you bring trouble." He rode out with an empty sack and a gut full of cold fury. The ranch was no longer a sanctuary. It was an island, and the tide was rising. The attacks began small, like the first probing bites of a wolf pack. A section of fence cut in the night, his cattle scattered across the open range. It took him and Nayland 2 days of relentless back-breaking work under a merciless sun to round them up. He watched her on horseback, her movements fluid and intuitive, guiding the animals with a quiet skill he could only admire. They worked in a seamless, unspoken partnership, a team forged in the crucible of their shared crisis. There was no master and servant. There were only 2 people against the world. A week later, the threat escalated. He found her standing by the well, her body rigid, one hand held up to stop him. A dead coyote lay half-submerged in the trough, its fur dark and matted. The water itself had a faint oily sheen, and the air around it carried a sour chemical tang that was not of the earth. Poison. They had tried to kill his herd. Now they were trying to kill them. That night, the work of mending fences became the work of building a fortress. Ethan's past, the one he had tried to bury, resurfaced. He was no longer a rancher. He was a soldier again, preparing for a siege. He boarded the lower windows, leaving only small slits for a rifle. He created barricades from overturned wagons and stacked firewood. Nalin worked beside him, her silence no longer a barrier but a shared resolve. She seemed to understand the geometry of a firefight, the importance of angles and cover, with an instinct that unnerved and impressed him. He knew what came next. It was a choice. He had been avoiding a line he was terrified to cross, but the poison in the well had left him no other path. He brought out the Winchester. He found her in the twilight, watching the road to town, a silent sentinel. The rifle felt unnaturally heavy in his hands. "They will not stop," he said, his voice flat. "This will come to more than cut fences. You need to know how to use this." She looked from his face to the rifle, her expression unreadable. For a moment he thought she would refuse, that the weapon was a symbol of a world she rightly despised. But she simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. The lesson was a strange, tense ballet. He stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder to steady her, showing her how to brace the stock, how to sight down the long steel barrel. He was acutely aware of her presence, of the warmth of her through the thin buckskin, of the quiet, even rhythm of her breathing. It was the closest they had ever been, this act of teaching a skill meant only for death. "Just breathe slow," he murmured, his voice lower than he intended. "Squeeze. Don't pull." She did not flinch when the rifle kicked against her shoulder. She did not waver. She simply reloaded, her movements economical and sure. She fired again, and again. The bottles he had set on a distant fence post exploded one after the other into glittering shards of glass. She held the weapon not like a tool, but like an extension of her own fierce will. In her hands, the rifle was not just an instrument of violence. It was an answer. They stood in the deepening dusk, the sharp, acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air around them, the last of the light glinting on the spent shell casings at their feet. They were ready. The final warning came just after midnight. It was not a voice, not a rider. It was a sound like a sudden sharp intake of breath, followed by a solid thump. Ethan threw open the door to see an arrow quivering in the thick wood of the porch post. Tied to its shaft with a strip of rawhide was a piece of parchment. He tore it free. The message was scrawled in a crude, angry hand, the ink a dark, rusty brown that looked unnervingly like dried blood. The town has judged you. Hand over the savage by dawn, or we will burn your sin from the earth. He looked up from the note, his knuckles white. Nalin stood in the doorway behind him, her eyes on the arrow. She had seen the message. She understood. There would be no more warnings. There would be no escape. The storm was no longer gathering. It was here. There is a quiet that comes before the dawn, a breathless, holy stillness where the world seems to hold its judgment. This was not that quiet. This was the coiled, waiting silence of a snake before the strike. Ethan stood at the boarded window, the cold, heavy weight of the Winchester, a familiar burden in his hands. He could taste the stale coffee on his tongue, see the faint gray light promising a day he might not live to see. Across the room, Nalin was a shadow against the far wall, a second rifle resting in the crook of her arms. She was perfectly still, her breathing so slow, and even he could not hear it. She had become a part of the house, a part of the land, a spirit of defiance waiting in the gloom. The first sign was not a sight but a sound carried on the pre-dawn wind. A low, guttural murmur, the sound of many voices fused into a single hateful growl. Then the light. Not the gentle blush of morning, but a series of angry, flickering stars on the horizon. Torches. They're here. Ethan said the words, a puff of white in the cold air. The night exploded. A wave of men crested the low ridge, a tide of darkness and fire. Shouts and curses tore the sacred quiet to shreds. A rifle cracked the bullet, thudding into the thick wood of the cabin wall, a harbinger of the violence to come. They were not soldiers. They were a mob drunk on righteousness and the promise of a righteous kill. "Hold Ethan," whispered his voice, a low command that barely disturbed the air. "Wait for the creek." He watched them come, a chaotic, stumbling mass. He felt the old, cold calm of the battlefield settle over him, a feeling he had prayed he would never feel again. He was not protecting a flag or a border. He was protecting a life, a soul. The thought was a searing, clarifying fire in his mind. The first attackers splashed through the shallow creek, their torches held high. Now, he said. Two rifles spoke as one. The night erupted in a symphony of fire and lead. The lead torch sputtered and died. Another fell hissing in the water. Panic rippled through the front line of the mob. They had expected a cornered, terrified man. They had not expected a coordinated, disciplined defense. They had not expected her. From his slit in the wall, Ethan saw Nalin move with a grace that defied the chaos. She fired, reloaded, and fired again, her movements economical and deadly. She was not frantic. She was focused, a hunter in her element, and the men who had come to burn her were now her prey. A new wave of shouts came from the right. "The barn! Burn him out!" Ethan swung his rifle toward the new threat, firing into the group of men carrying oil cans. But in that moment, he failed to see a shadow detach itself from the chaos on his left, a man crawling through the tall grass, a pistol glinting in the torchlight. He only registered the flash of fire, the immediate, deafening roar. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded behind his eyes. The world dissolved into a sickening, spinning vortex of darkness and light. He staggered back from the window, a cry strangled in his throat and crumpled to the floor, the rifle clattering from his numb fingers. The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was Nalin turning from her position, her face transformed. The stillness was gone, replaced by a mask of cold, primal fury. A warrior queen, a protector. He drifted in a sea of pain, the sounds of the battle a distant, muffled thunder. He felt a hand gently turn his head, the sting of whiskey on a rag against his temple where the bullet had grazed him. He forced his eyes open. Nalin was crouched over him, shielding his body with her own, firing the Winchester over his head toward the door. She was holding the line. Alone. The sight of it, the sheer impossible courage of it, cut through his daze. He pushed himself up his head, a universe of agony. He grabbed his Colt from his holster, his hand shaking. "Nalin," he rasped. She glanced at him, her eyes fierce, and in them he saw not fear, but a shared, terrible purpose. The mob's will was breaking. This was not the easy lynching they had been promised. They were bleeding. They were dying. Then Silas Kane appeared, his face a contorted mask of rage, stepping over one of his own fallen men. He charged the porch, his eyes wild. "That savage is mine!" he screamed, raising his pistol. Ethan rose to his knees, leveling his Colt, the world swimming in his vision. But Nalin was faster. Her rifle cracked once. The pistol flew from Silas's hand, spinning into the darkness. He stared at his empty, stinging fingers, his face a ruin of shock and disbelief. That final expert shot broke them. The mob dissolved, its courage shattered. They scrambled back across the creek, dragging their wounded, their furious shouts turning into whimpers of retreat. Silas stood alone for a moment, his face illuminated by the burning torches they had left behind his eyes, promising a new and more terrible vengeance. Then he too turned and vanished into the night. Silence returned, profound and heavy, broken only by the crackle of a few small fires. Ethan leaned against the wall, the adrenaline fading, leaving only a deep, throbbing agony. He looked at the woman beside him, her face smudged with gunpowder, her eyes reflecting the flames of the wreckage. They had won. They had held the line. But as the first gray light of dawn touched the splintered wood of their home and the dark stains on the earth, Ethan knew with a bone-deep certainty that while the battle was over, the war was lost. This land would never be their sanctuary. Dawn broke not with the gentle promise of a new day, but with the cold, gray light of a battlefield's aftermath. The air was thick with the ghosts of violence, the sharp tang of gunpowder, the bitter scent of smoke, the coppery smell of spilt blood that the thirsty earth had already begun to claim. Ethan sat on the splintered porch steps, his head throbbing with a dull, insistent rhythm. Nalin knelt before him, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the gash on his temple with a strip of cloth dipped in whiskey. The sting of it was a grounding force, a sharp reminder that he was alive. He watched her hands, no longer seeing a stranger or a prisoner, but a partner, a warrior. "They'll be back," he said, his voice a raw whisper, "with the law this time. Or what passes for it." Nalin finished her work and looked past him at the bullet-riddled walls of the house, at the dead earth of the yard. She said nothing for a long moment, then her gaze met his. "This is not a home," she said, her voice soft but absolute. Not anymore. He knew she was right. The dream of this place of a sanctuary built against the world had died in the night. It had been consecrated with blood and fire and could no longer hold life. He pushed himself to his feet and walked into the ravaged house one last time. He went to the small iron lockbox where he kept his important papers, the pathetic relics of a settled life. He pulled out the deed to the ranch. He brought it out to her, the paper feeling flimsy and obscene in his hand. "This paper," he began, his voice thick with a history of shame. "It says I own this land. It says I owned you." He held it out to her, an offering. It was always a lie. "Take it. It's yours." Nalin looked at the document, at the strange spidery script that had the power to chain a soul. She saw the world of men in that single piece of paper, their laws, their fences, their brands. Then she looked at Ethan's face, at the plea for forgiveness in his eyes. She shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion. Gently she took the deed from his hand. She walked not into the house, but to the smoldering remains of a barricade. Without ceremony, she dropped the paper into the glowing red embers. They watched together as the edges curled, turned black, and dissolved into weightless gray ash. The lie was unwritten. The ownership was unmade. He understood. Ethan turned, picked up a half-burnt piece of timber that was still glowing, and walked to the barn. He held it to the dry hay. Nalin did the same, taking a splintered board to the curtains in the house Alara had sewn so long ago. They moved through the ruins not with rage, but with a solemn, ritualistic purpose. They were not destroying a home. They were setting a memory free. They gathered what little was left: 2 horses, the rifles, a single water skin, and a small pouch of Nalin's healing herbs. As they rode to the ridge overlooking the valley, they did not look back. The fire behind them was a new sunrise, a fierce and cleansing light consuming the gilded cage and the ghosts that haunted it. It was a funeral pyre for the past. He looked at the woman riding beside him, her profile etched against the flames. No longer a shadow, no longer a prisoner, no longer a means to atone for a different woman's memory. She was Nalin, his partner, his reckoning, his redemption. The fire cast their long shadows forward, 2 solitary figures riding north into the unknown mountains, into a world they would have to build for themselves, one sunrise at a time.